conversation with the Middle East Monitor, I spoke to Professor Omer Bartov. He is an Israeli-born historian, professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown University, where he has taught since 2000. Bartov is the author of Genocide, the Holocaust and Israel-Palestine, First-Person History in Times of Crisis. During our conversation, I asked Professor Bartov to share his insights on Israel's ongoing military operation in Gaza. We discuss the recent legal action against Israel at the ICC, filed by South Africa, accusing Israel of the crime of genocide. I get his views on that. We talk about the role of the Holocaust in shaping Israel's policies and the pervasive demonization of Palestinians within Israeli society and how that's fueling the kind of radical policies we see in Israel. Bartov's insight into the cost of impunity and how to hold Israel accountable for its illegal occupation and subjugation is also, I think, worth listening to. And also we spoke about the future, how the conflict may end. With an eye on the future, we look at what a positive judgment at the ICJ could mean for the Palestinians and Israel, while also considering the need for external pressure to change the incentive structures, which has allowed Israel to enjoy the level of impunity it has and the cost preoccupation that it has enjoyed all these decades. So I hope you enjoyed the conversation and speak to you for another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. Welcome to the show and thank you for joining us, Professor Bartov.
Thank you very much for having me.
I'll call you Omar if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Okay, Omar. So let's just jump straight into your book, actually. What is your book about? I mentioned it, the Holocaust, Israel and Palestine, first-person history in times of crisis. What is your book about? I think it was published last year. And what do you think are the most valuable insights from your book that can help inform our understanding of what's happening over the last 3 weeks?
Yes,
sorry, 3 months.
Yeah, thank you for this question. The book was written before all of this happened, but in some ways, at least for me, it helps me understand some of what we are watching right now. It does several things. It tries to talk about the relationship between the Holocaust as a particular event and the phenomenon of genocide more generally. And we have heard, as you know now, there's been a great deal of talk about genocide and a great deal of talk about the Holocaust. And so what is the relationship between them? That's one discussion. Another discussion has to do with the relationship between Jewish history in Eastern Europe and the history of Zionism and of Palestinians in Palestine, Israel, and how those are connected, not only historically and not only by analogy, but also by the fact that many Jews came from Eastern Europe to Palestine and created what became the State of Israel and were also, among other things, as a displaced population themselves, those who displaced others, that is, those who displaced Palestinians in vast numbers in 1948. And finally, the book talks about what I am very interested in is the question of first-person history, that when you tell history from the level of individuals, when you see it through their eyes, and when you listen to them carefully and empathize with what they say, whether you agree with them or not, but you just see them as human beings, then you begin to understand histories of conflict very differently. You begin to come to, I would say, a level of empathy that is possibly the first step toward some kind of reconciliation. So I'd say that's the 3 most important insights of that book, certainly as regards the current conflict.
I I was looking at a book today. I actually read it a number of years ago. It's Arab and the Holocaust by a professor from SOAS University. I think he has since retired. Akhtar, I think his name is.
Yes.
And it's interesting how this book dispels a lot of the myths about, one of the common tropes about the Israelis' Zionist narrative is that the Arab helped in the genocide and Holocaust of Jews. And Netanyahu went as far as to say that, Hitler did not want to kill the Jews. It was Husseini who convinced him, which is one of the most shocking things you'd ever hear from an Israeli prime minister. But there we go. He said that. And the book basically shows how the Arabs were very sympathetic towards the plight of the Jews in Europe. He covered all the major newspapers, all the Arab leaders, by and large, they're all very sympathetic and hostile to Nazi Germany. But that doesn't really get shown within the Israeli narrative. So I was wondering, is that story never told? And are Israelis focused on simply one aspect of the genocide or Holocaust, which is that the whole world kind of came together to, kill the Jews or annihilate the Jews? Is that a story that's is it beneficial for going forward? Is that in your point of view? Are we telling the wrong story of the Holocaust, so to speak?
That's a very good question, and it's a very complicated question. I think that for many Israelis, the Holocaust is the main justification for the state of Israel. They understand the history of the Holocaust as one in which there were Jews persecuted in Europe who were trying to get out, and nobody would let them in. So that sense of betrayal, the sense that when you don't have your own country and you're a minority in a continent that is trying to either to exterminate you or just to get rid of you in one way or another, you're not wanted, but you cannot go anywhere else. That is very deep within an Israeli collective sense of history, of memory, and of identity. And it's not entirely false, of course. And so Israel sees itself and presents itself as the safe haven for Jews. So after the establishment of the state, if Jews are persecuted anywhere, they could always come to Israel, be protected by that country. So that's one side of it. The other side of it is that I would say since especially the 1980s, the Holocaust has become a kind of instrument for Israeli politicians, particularly on the right, as a tool to ward off any criticism of Israel, claiming that any criticism of Israeli policies, policies of settlement, of expansion, of oppression, is by definition anti-Semitic, and that any threat to Israeli security, be it the first or the second Intifada or any other war, is a threat to the existence of the very state. That is, it is a threat of potential Holocaust. And if you think about your own history, your own reality through that kind of prism, you are imprisoned by it. That is, you see your enemies not as people that you can negotiate with, that you can compromise with, but rather as potential genocidaires, as potential people who will commit genocide against you, and therefore the only way to deal with them is to fight them off or to kill them. And that has made, I'd say, the view by Israelis of their own reality greatly distorted. And it has had, since October 7th, it has come up often, that sense that we have to do everything to protect ourselves from massacres, and therefore we have license to do whatever we need as we define it, and nobody can tell us how to behave.
And we saw that playing out here in the UK as well. A number of pro-Israeli or commentators who were sympathetic to Israel, like Douglas Murray, they've gone to great lengths to make the argument that Hamas is worse than the Nazis. That's another form of genocide denial, in my point of view. When you say something like that, that Hamas is worse than Hitler, which kind of, as you said, gives license to do and say anything you want with the enemy. But on that conflict itself, do you think, I know you take slightly different view to some of the other people I interviewed, like Rev Siegel, who said that what we're seeing in Gaza is a textbook case of genocide, and others have mentioned that as well. I think you take a slightly different view to that. So can you explain your view on that? And is it accurate to describe what's happening in Gaza, what's been happening over the last 3 months is genocide?
Look, again, this is a very complicated issue, and I'm trying to understand what is going on the ground as things evolve over time, based on whatever information we have, and our information is incomplete, of course. I warned already in early November that Israeli actions in Gaza could develop into genocide. I think that if we look at what has happened since, we can reach some conclusions. They are, of course, dependent on facts coming out. But my sense is the following: that the kind of policy that or tactics that the IDF has been using have caused major destruction in Gaza, and particularly northern Gaza, much of which has been flattened, has brought about enormous population displacement. That is about 85% of the population has been displaced and has been concentrated in a very small part of Gaza. Now, this is not a coincidence. This is part of a policy, of a tactics by the Israeli army, and that can be interpreted in two different ways. It can be interpreted as, so to speak, humanitarian actions. That is, you remove the population from areas of operations, of military operations, so as to protect them. And that's what the Israeli army is claiming it is doing. Or you can say it is a policy of intentional displacement and destruction of the areas from which the population is being displaced, with the goal of never letting them back in and potentially removing them entirely from the Gaza Strip or from large parts of it, which appears to be what is actually going on. So what does that mean in terms of international crimes or crimes under international law? I think there's good evidence that Israel has been involved, the IDF has been involved in war crimes, and because of the very high numbers of civilians killed, it's now around 23,000, at least 2/3 of whom are civilians, half of whom are children, that it's also crimes against humanity. Whether it's genocide, as far as I can say right now, it depends on the next few weeks. Because if this policy that is carried out right now by the Israeli military and the state continues, it means that there is now a humanitarian crisis in these camps where now internal refugees, internally displaced people find themselves. The death rate may rise very quickly. It is, of course, already very high, and there may be an attempt to push them out. That will look like ethnic cleansing or forcible displacement of population, which comes under, could come under crimes against humanity and or genocide. If that is stopped and things are reversed, which I don't predict happening, but may happen because of external pressures, especially by the US, then things will look different. So I think we are right now right on the verge of this becoming a clear policy of ethnic cleansing, which can result in genocide. And of course, we know that this is now has been handed over to the International Court of Justice and will be deliberated by a panel of judges there, which may give us also some more clarity, at least as to how a group of distinguished jurists understand this.
Yeah, we'll speak about that, the ICJ case that's been lodged by South Africa. I mean, it is interesting what you said. I mean, in 3 weeks' time, there'll be more clarity. I mean, I myself at the beginning, I observed my views as well. Of course, we're very critical of Israel, and I saw how my perspectives have changed based on what happened on the ground. I did not envisage this level of bombardment, and to me, it seemed like it was a clear intent to ethnically cleanse or even commit genocide right from the beginning, based on what the Israeli leaders were saying. And some of the figures that came out, and I did a historical comparison, I found it quite shocking. One of them being, Palestinians are being killed at a higher rate by the Israelis in the so-called targeted bombing of Gaza than Brits that were being killed by Germany during the during Nazi bombing, and I found that quite shocking. At that time, in the 8 months of bombing by the Luftwaffe, German Luftwaffe, 40,000 civilians were killed during that war in 8 months. And if Israel was to continue its current rate of destruction on Gaza, there would be more than 80,000 Palestinians killed. So even though Israel claims to be carrying out its bombing in a targeted way, whereas the German bombing was seen as being indiscriminate. So I found those kind of figures to be, wow, quite shocking, and it kind of changed my view pretty quickly that.
Well, let me say just, I mean, I think that there's no question by now that Israeli bombing has been indiscriminate, and not only indiscriminate, but in quite a number of cases, intentional. Intentional bombing of civilians and intentional destruction of civilian structures, including schools and hospitals and so forth. I don't think there's any question about that. The problem with the definition of genocide is that it's not a question of numbers. Now, numbers, of course, matter. They matter a great deal, and one should not, dismiss that. But it's not necessarily a matter of numbers. The Allied bombing of Germany in World War II, not the German bombing of Britain, but the British and American bombing of Germany of open cities, intentional bombing of civilians, killed about 600,000 German civilians. But it would probably not come under genocide because there was no intention to destroy the German people as such, which is part of the definition of genocide, calls to show an intention to destroy a group as such. It is possible that you could show now that what Israel is doing in Gaza is, the intention has already been expressed, is an attempt to destroy the Palestinian people as such, in whole or in part. So at least its part in Gaza. If that can be shown, then this would be genocide. And there have been statements by Israeli politicians and by Israeli generals indicating that. But that's a difficult thing to show, because you can claim that many of these statements were done in the heat of the moment, they are for propaganda purposes, but that the actual policy is not that. So unfortunately, even if the numbers go up, that is not what would necessarily mean that it's genocide. But I think that we are very close to that, because the policy appears increasingly to be a policy of removal of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip, and that could come under genocide.
So talking about the ICJ, I was wondering if I can get your views on that, the International Court of Justice, a case lodged by South Africa accusing Israel of genocide, and basically trying to get restraining order on Israel and trying to stop the current campaign. As seems to be, as you said, it's not a slam dunk because there are 15 judges. Not all will be judging on the basis of the merit of the case. There'll be lots of political calculations there. So just give us your thoughts on that. Do you think we could see, or we could expect, a positive judgment by the ICJ judges in favor of Palestinians, given difficulties you just mentioned, and also given how the judges are representing their own specific countries and the politics of their country. I can't expect, for example, a German judge to uh, judge in favor of the Palestinians and say there is genocide, or an American judge to do the same. So given the proportion of the judges and what we know of the case, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, listen, I mean, I've I've thought a fair amount about this, and I think first of all, the move by South Africa to file this with the ICJ was very important, and as you know, quite unique. I mean, this is a very rare case. Um, and there are two levels to this. One is whether the ICJ would pronounce an injunction on Israel to stop military action while it deliberates this question of genocide, because the deliberations themselves could take years. But the call to stop Israel from continuing its campaign in Gaza and potentially from leaving Gaza, that can come quickly. Now, the ICJ has no way to enforce that. So this would go to the Security Council. In the Security Council, it is possible, although not certain, that the US would then veto this. However, the very fact that you have the ICJ deliberating this question and the potential that it would then, that there would be a call by the ICJ for at least a temporary halt on operations, and that it would go to the Security Council, all of that has major implications for what is going on. I think one of the most important things is that Israel is highly dependent on both diplomatic cover by Israel and other countries, by the US and other countries, and on military supplies, and a huge amount of supplies streaming from the United States to Israel. Many countries have their own laws that say you cannot supply arms to countries that are suspect of breaches of human rights. And Israel would be at least a suspect of that because it would have been lodged with the ICJ. And therefore, this can have both a sort of in the international arena in general, and specifically regarding assistance to Israel, this can and probably will have a major impact on whatever happens on the ground. So I think while it also shows that the international humanitarian law is international, and therefore states decide, and states decide according to their own national interests, the fact that it has come to that will already have an impact. Will it change things altogether? I don't know. But I can tell you that in Israel, people who are in the military and in various politicians are very worried about this. And one indication of it is that Netanyahu has appointed, Prime Minister Netanyahu has appointed Aaron Barak, who he saw as his enemy, the former Chief Justice in the Supreme Court, as the judge who would be the Israeli judge on the ICJ. According to the ICJ, the country lodging the complaint and the country that the complaint is against can have a judge of their own there, and Barak will be the Israeli judge there. That means that Netanyahu is very worried about what will become of that. So I think it is an important move. It won't be a game changer, but it will have an effect, and probably a substantial effect.
Yeah, you mentioned Netanyahu, and a lot of times, I mean, it's we've seen politicians here in UK, for example. It's easy to blame Netanyahu from where I'm sitting, and we know that he has been the longest-serving Israeli prime minister. And recent polls, I've seen a number of polls coming out showing that Israelis themselves, they think that the government is not going hard enough on the Palestinians on Gaza. So I think the question I'm asking is going back to what we started off with, the memory of the Holocaust and seeing your enemy constantly as as the Nazis. Is there something in the psyche which makes Israel feel that, or there's a national ethos within Israel um, that sees enemies as something that needs to be obliterated, destroyed, or at least a section or factions within the Israeli society to view military conflict in such a way? Because polls are suggesting that Netanyahu is not going far enough. He should be more aggressive towards the Palestinians. So it doesn't seem to be simply a case of Netanyahu's problem, Netanyahu's doing. It's something which is something more ingrained within sections of Israeli society.
So look, I mean, I think you can talk about this on three levels. The first is we do have to remember that what happened on October 7th was totally shocking to Israeli society. Nothing like that had happened before, not even in 1948, which Israelis certainly remember as a kind of war of existence, that close to 1,000 civilians were killed, murdered, old people, babies, children. There were many documented rapes, and the Israeli army didn't show up for hours and hours and hours. Took 8 hours, 9 hours, 12 hours. That created both a sense of deep insecurity that Hamas militants could just walk into the country and take over an entire part of southern Israel, with the IDF incapable of responding in time, and a powerful urge for revenge. Revenge is never a good motivation for anything, not for personal behavior, not for war, and not for politics, but it does exist. And an urge by the IDF, which, let's be clear, screwed up big time, to show that it can win over again the Israeli public and its own honor. And there's a lot of talk about honor there. So that's one thing, and we have to remember that. That's very different from anything else, and the response to it, therefore, has also been very different. The second thing is the issue with Netanyahu. Netanyahu is probably the most unpopular man in Israel today. If there were elections today, he will probably get 15% of the vote or something like that, if he's lucky. And not only because of what happened on October 7th, but because of what happened before October 7th, where he tried to carry out a judicial coup to basically weaken the Supreme Court and to expand the power of the executive, meaning himself, because he's indicted and he's known to be deeply involved in corruption, and because of the incredible incompetence of the Israeli government after October 7th. Much of, about 150,000 Israeli citizens have been displaced in the north and in the south, on the Lebanon border and on the Gaza border. And who is taking care of those displaced people? It's mostly volunteers who were those who were protesting against Netanyahu before October 7th, because the government can't get its act together. So Netanyahu is highly unpopular. Now, the last issue. I think, yes, I think right now in Israel, including in those who perceive themselves as being more liberal, more on the left, there is a real strong urge, if not for revenge, certainly as Israelis see it, to destroy Hamas, whatever that means and whatever it takes. And a kind of indifference to what is happening in Gaza, much of which is not being reported on the Israeli media. You'd be hard put to find any actual reports on Israeli media about the mass killing of civilians in Gaza. They're reporting about heroic soldiers, but not about what they're actually doing there. I think that is, I mean, to me, of course, it's deeply saddening to see this, but I think that can and probably is already changing. And the reason it's changing is that it is becoming clear that the IDF did not only have a fiasco on October 7th, it's it's actual military operation. It's attempt to win over now a sense that it can do things well has not worked. The operation itself, from the military point of view, from the point of view of how the Israeli government and the IDF define their goals to release the hostages, and there's still 136 hostages being held now for 3 months by Hamas, has failed. And the second stated goal of destroying Hamas as a political and military organization has also failed. They're still fighting them, and the number of Israeli casualties is growing. So I think that if the current political leadership, and one has to understand, Netanyahu wants the war to continue. As long as the war continues, he stays in power. So he is a main obstacle, not because Israelis like him or not because Israelis don't want revenge, but he is a main obstacle because he wants the war to go on. And he doesn't care about the hostages or anything. He wants this to continue. And the war now may well evolve into a war also in Lebanon, and also with Iranian militias in Syria, and also with the Houthis. It can become, a regional war. He doesn't care because he can stay in power. If Netanyahu is removed and Israel has a more rational, it won't be a liberal government, but a more rational government that actually looks to the interests of the state of Israel, then that war will change its nature and the Israeli public will be happy about it. But right now, under his leadership, I think this kind of constant incitement from the government itself is only making things worse. So I think, I'm not optimistic. I don't know what the mechanism will be to change the government, but from my point of view, if major international pressure, particularly American pressure, is put on the Israeli government, it can eventually also bring about the downfall of the Netanyahu administration. I think that's what the Americans would want. And I think Netanyahu would not be able to make concessions, which the Americans should insist on without losing his coalition.
So going back to October 7th, what level of scrutiny from your, because you follow the Israeli press quite closely, and before October 7th, you headed a group to sign a public letter, condemning Netanyahu's attempt to overhaul the judiciary. And in that, you described Israel as being practicing the crime of apartheid and ethnic cleansing, and you got a lot of support for that letter. So there is, of course, resistance and opposition to Netanyahu. What kind of resistance and scrutiny are we seeing on October 7 itself? Because one of the questions a lot of people are asking is how can Israeli army have taken 6 hours to respond to something like that? So are there more probing questions like that? And also the Israeli allegations that Israeli soldiers themselves shot down and killed Israelis in some of the settlements. Is that something that is being asked, these kind of questions, probing questions within the Israeli society at the moment?
Yes, there are, and again, you are touching on two issues. One is that a number of colleagues and myself issued that statement on August 4th, so 2 months before the Hamas attack, and what we said, we called it the elephant in the room, and what we said was that the attempted judicial overhaul, meaning judicial coup by the government, was not simply in order to increase the power of the executive and weaken the judiciary, but actually it was about the occupation. That the occupation was the elephant in the room, and most of the protest in Israel at the time was not refused to talk about that. Those who were protesting against the judicial overhaul did not want to talk about the occupation. They said that's another issue. And we said, no, it's not another issue. It is the issue. that the government under Netanyahu and with the even more radical settler ministers to his right want to enhance the settlement in the West Bank, want to ethnically cleanse as much as they can the West Bank, and want to annex large parts of the West Bank. And that's why they want to remove any judicial oversight of these policies. That is what it was about. And at the core of everything we are seeing now is the occupation. That is the main engine of everything we are seeing now. Without dealing with that issue, nothing can be resolved. So that's crucial to understand. Now, is the scrutiny of October 7th in Israel? There are two sides of it. On the one hand, October 7th is constantly being recycled in the Israeli media. Every day, there are different stories of what happened there. And that so triggers all the emotions in the Israeli public about the horrors that occurred there. And that, in a sense, gives more sort of time for operations in Gaza because it's saying, look what they did to us. But on the other hand, more and more information is coming out about how badly the army conducted itself, how unprepared it was. There were, of course, many, individual cases of heroic actions and so forth, as they're reported in the Israeli media, but also several. First of all, the entire framework of the lack of response, and secondly, all kind of particular actions. One of them is an action that happened in a kibbutz where I actually have relatives myself, in kibbutz Be'eri, where a tank was ordered by a commander, by a general, to fire probably at least two tank shells at a house where there were both Hamas militants and hostages. And that now is known, has been reported. There may have been some other cases. I would say that shows incompetence, a lack of preparation. This was reported also in the New York Times in a very important sort of investigative journalism that they did. I don't think it takes Hamas off the hook, though. And I don't think that Hamas will be taken off the hook. And just as I'd like to see Israeli generals and other officers and politicians put in front of an international court, I would like to see, it's unlikely that it'll happen, some of these Hamas militants who raped and mutilated also charged with crimes against humanity and war crimes. But again, we have to think about the context of this. To me, the context is important. It does not condone what Hamas did, but it's important to understand. The context of this is that Gaza had been under Israeli siege for 16 years, that people are being brutalized by the siege, that Hamas, in its own way, prepared to make a statement so that the Palestinian issue would not be swept under the rug. And it succeeded in doing that. It succeeded in bringing back the Palestinian issue to the fore at a huge cost, enormous cost to everyone, but especially to Palestinian civilians in Gaza.
And that leads us neatly to a final question on the context and the incentive structures, let's just say, that has created the cycle of violence that we've seen over the decades and the occupation. So given the situation, given the power imbalance, can you see Israel ending its occupation, especially given that it has shifted more and more to the right, and Israel's major allies, the US and UK, have been almost indifferent and allowed this impunity to go on without saying anything, doing anything. And on top of that, we've seen Arab regimes, Arab countries who have normalized relationship, despite the fact that the occupation still exists. Israel is illegally occupying West Bank and Gaza. There doesn't seem to be any pushback against that. So do you think that we'll see the kind of incentives that's required to break the status quo and create a situation, an impetus for the ending of the occupation and Palestinians given the right to self-determination?
I think we have now, unfortunately, under horrific circumstances, We have now the best opportunity to do so in decades. And the question is whether this opportunity will be seized. So in Israel, yes, Israel has been moving to the right, and possibly it's moved even more to the right since October 7th, but Israel also is filled with a huge sense of fragility and insecurity. No one feels secure in Israel right now. This is a completely different Israel from what it was before October 7th, where people could simply ignore what was happening in Gaza, what was happening in the West Bank, and live their own comfortable lives. This has changed. It's a completely different world. And the chance of it getting even worse with hundreds of thousands of reservists coming back from reserve service and finding that they don't have their jobs, that the state is not helping them. There is a sort of, I would say, a potential political and social earthquake in Israel itself. So that is one thing that we have to take into account. Yes, a sort of shift to the right, but also a great fragility in the society. But the change will not come from within. It won't come from within, not among Israelis, and unfortunately also not from Palestinians. It has to come from the outside. And this is an opportunity now for the United States, together with its major allies, with Germany, with France, with the UK, to understand what is happening now is that can spin out of control entirely. The entire Middle East now is, no one knows what's going to happen. And once things start rolling, they may get out of control entirely. What the United States has to do now is to devise a strategic plan, which includes negotiations toward a settlement of the conflict between Israel and Palestine. That has to happen now. And they're talking about it, but they're not actually following up on their own rhetoric, which is weak and not quite decisive. This is known, by the way, this is being said by some circles in Israel itself, that Antony Blinken is traveling around the Middle East with an empty suitcase. He has nothing to provide. What he has to provide is force. What he has to provide is sanctions. Israel depends now more than at any other time since 1948 on the United States. It depends on it for political cover. It depends on it for war. The United States has to use that, not simply to force its hands and not simply for a ceasefire, because a ceasefire would be good, but it's hardly sufficient, but to devise a plan, which is not very hard to come up with, really, to solve this issue once and for all. It won't happen from today to tomorrow, but there has to be a political horizon toward it. If that happens, I think Israeli society, because it is so fragile and insecure right now, will be willing to, and in many ways forced, to accept that. And I think Palestinian society, which is undergoing horrendous suffering, will also be open, I'm hoping, will be open to looking at a positive political horizon rather than an ongoing intransigence on both sides and ongoing violence, which each time there's a cycle gets even worse. I think it's an opportunity and it has to be seized.
Thank you for that, Professor Bartov. And let's end on that optimistic note. I want to thank you and also the viewers at home for joining. See you for another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.